Few figures in medieval history have exerted such a profound and multifaceted impact as Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. Monk, mystic, advisor to popes and kings, political negotiator, preacher of crusades, and religious reformer, Bernard was a man whose words and deeds transcended his own era, shaping centuries of Christian spirituality. Born in 1090 and deceased in 1153, this French aristocrat renounced wealth and privilege to embrace monastic austerity, ultimately becoming what many historians consider the most influential figure of 12th century Europe. The story we are about to explore is not merely a biography of a saint, but a captivating dive into the intricate relationships between faith and power, contemplation and action that defined the height of the Middle Ages. Prepare yourself to meet the man behind the title, Dr. Mellifluus, the doctor whose words flow sweet as honey, whose legacy continues to inspire and challenge our understanding of spirituality, leadership, and personal transformation. Chapter 1. Origins, Education, and Entry into Monastic Life. Born in 1090 at the Castle of Fontaine, near Dijon in Burgundy, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux emerged from noble lineage to become one of the most transformative figures in medieval Christianity. His parents, Tescelin and Aleth de Montbard, belonged to the Burgundian aristocracy and provided young Bernard with an outstanding education. At the age of 9, he was sent to school in Châtillon-sur-Seine, where his intellectual brilliance in literature and rhetoric already foreshadowed the powerful orator who would later inspire multitudes. The death of his mother around 1109 marked a turning point in the life of the then 19-year-old Bernard. Profoundly affected by the fragility of earthly existence, Bernard felt an irresistible call to abandon the promises of aristocratic life in favor of solitude and prayer. The recently founded Cistercian order, established in 1098 by Saint Robert of Molesmes to restore the original rigor of the rule of Saint Benedict, became the destination of his spiritual quest. Bernard's extraordinary charisma manifested from the very start of his religious vocation. In 1113, upon joining the Abbey of Citeaux under the guidance of Abbot St. Stephen Harding, Bernard did not arrive alone. He brought along about 30 young nobles, including 4 of his brothers, and even an uncle. This power of persuasion, which would later influence kings and popes, was already evident in his ability to inspire radical conversions within his own family. Though still young and not yet ordained as a priest, Bernard's holiness and leadership talents were so evident that, in 1115, at only 25 years old, he was tasked with founding and leading a new abbey in the Valley of Absinthe, which he renamed Clairvaux, Clear Valley. The first years were marked by extreme austerity, severely affecting his health and prompting Bishop William of Champeaux to intervene and moderate the harshness of communal discipline. After this adjustment, Clairvaux flourished remarkably. Bernard's reputation for holiness attracted disciples from all over Europe, including nobles, intellectuals, and even his sister, Humbelina, who initially led a secular life before becoming a Benedictine nun. The monastery soon became too small to accommodate the influx of new vocations, compelling Bernard to found daughter monasteries such as Trois Fontaines, 1118, Fontenay, 1119, and Foigny, 1121. At the height of his youth, before reaching 30 years old, Bernard already participated in the first general chapter of the Cistercians in 1119, where his words on returning to primitive fervor resonated deeply. During this chapter, the Charter of Charity, the constitution of the order, was established and approved by Pope Calixtus II. Bernard's spiritual journey reveals how the dedication of a single individual can trigger transformations that resonate through centuries in the history of faith. If you are fascinated by inspiring stories of saints who changed the course of history, continue accompanying us on our journey through the extraordinary life of this doctor of the Church who shaped medieval Christianity. Chapter 2. Influence on the Church and Medieval Politics. Although a monk dedicated to cloistered life, Saint Bernard exercised unprecedented influence over the ecclesiastical and political affairs of his time, becoming one of the most decisive figures of the 12th century. His most impactful intervention occurred during the papal schism of 1130, when simultaneous elections resulted in factions divided between Pope Innocent II and the anti-Pope Anacletus II. At this critical moment for Christian unity, King Louis VI of France convened a council at Étampes, and, recognizing Bernard's wisdom and integrity, appointed him as the arbiter of this theological political dilemma. Bernard's decision to support Innocent II demonstrated not only his spiritual insight, but also his diplomatic acumen. Without hesitation, he undertook an exhausting journey across Europe, persuading monarchs and church leaders to abandon the anti-pope. In England, he convinced King Henry I and the English bishops to shift their allegiance. In Germany, with the assistance of Saint Norbert, he secured imperial backing, and he personally accompanied Innocent II to Italy, presenting him to Emperor Lothair III and carefully assembling a coalition that would isolate Anacletus II. Bernard's genuine humility became evident in Milan, where, after successfully persuading the powerful Milanese see to return to papal obedience and deposing a rebellious archbishop, he declined the prestigious position of archbishop offered to him. This renunciation of eminent power did not diminish his moral authority. On the contrary, it elevated it, as all recognized that his interventions were not motivated by personal ambition, but by genuine concern for the well-being of the Church. In theological matters, Bernard did not hesitate to confront intellectual movements he considered harmful to the faith. In 1141, at the Council of Sens, he brought accusations against the renowned philosopher Peter Abelard, whose theological positions he viewed as heterodox. The confrontation between these two intellectual giants led to the condemnation of Abelard's doctrines. Abelard subsequently sought refuge at Cluny, under the protection of Peter the Venerable, where he died shortly thereafter, an episode highlighting Bernard's unyielding zeal in defense of orthodoxy. Equally significant was Bernard's campaign against emerging heresies in southern France. In 1145, at the request of the papal legate Alberic of Ostia, Bernard traveled to the Languedoc to confront groups led by Henry of Lausanne and influenced by Peter of Bruys. His ascetic presence and fervent preaching resulted in mass conversions, with crowds abandoning deviant doctrines to return to Catholic orthodoxy. During this mission, Bernard also addressed the early manifestations of Catharism, demonstrating his keen ability to identify and combat emerging threats to religious unity. The peak of Bernard's influence within the ecclesiastical hierarchy occurred when one of his close disciples, Eugenius III, was elected pope in 1145. Mindful of the wisdom of his former mentor, the new pontiff requested guidance on governing the Church. Bernard responded with the profound treatise De Consideratione, on consideration, articulating a lofty vision of the papacy that combined authority with humility and contemplation. He advised that any reform of the Church must begin with the personal sanctity of the Pope himself, establishing a paradigm of spiritual leadership that would influence generations of religious leaders. Sedan, Chapter 3. Role in the Second Crusade and relationship with the Knights Templar. Saint Bernard's fame as a passionate preacher and visionary spiritual leader culminated in his crucial role in the Crusades, especially after the traumatic fall of the city of Edessa to the Seljuk Turks in 1144. This event deeply alarmed the Christian world and led Pope Eugene III to call for a Second Crusade, personally choosing Bernard as his chief herald, a decision that would shape both the fate of the Holy Land and the saint's reputation. Despite his weakened health due to years of monastic austerity, Bernard tirelessly traveled across Europe from 1146, igniting the hearts of the faithful for the sacred cause. His most extraordinary sermon took place on March 31st of that year, on a hill in Vézelay, France, before King Louis VII and Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine. With electrifying eloquence, Bernard cried out to the crowd, "O you who hear me, clothe yourselves with the shield of the cross. Hasten to atone for your sins through victories over the infidels, and let the liberation of the holy places be the reward for your repentance." The response was immediate. Shouts of "Deus vult," God wills it, echoed across the hill as crowds rushed to enlist. The popular enthusiasm was so overwhelming that there was a shortage of fabric to make the crosses that volunteers sewed onto their clothes as a symbol of commitment. In a dramatic gesture immortalized in medieval chronicles, Bernard himself, driven by spiritual fervor, began tearing his own monastic cloak into pieces to make more crosses and distribute them to the pleading pilgrims, a powerful image symbolizing his personal sacrifice for the divine mission. Bernard's persuasive power transcended borders and social classes. Even the skeptical King Conrad III of Germany, initially reluctant to join the expedition, yielded to the monk's compelling rhetoric after hearing reports of miracles accompanying his preaching journey. Conrad and his nephew, the future Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, received the cross directly from Bernard's hands, completing his extraordinary diplomatic feat of uniting the two greatest European powers, France and Germany, in a common cause, something almost unprecedented in that era of feudal rivalries. However, reality proved ruthless against Bernard's hopes. Despite the initial fervor and the large armies mobilized, the Second Crusade, 1147 to 1149, ended in a devastating military failure. The Christian troops suffered humiliating defeats along the march and failed to recapture Edessa or take Damascus in 1148. For Bernard, who had promised victory in God's name, the failure was not just a strategic defeat, but a personal and spiritual crisis, leading him to refer to that period of his life as a time of disgrace. Even before this setback in the Crusades, Bernard had already played a decisive role in the crusading movement through his close relationship with the Knights Templar. In 1128, he actively participated in the Council of Troyes, where he helped formulate the monastic rule that would guide this religious military order, granting it canonical legitimacy. Responding to requests from Hugh de Payens, the first Grand Master of the Templars, Bernard wrote the influential treatise, De Laude Novae Militia, in praise of the new knighthood, where he revolutionized the concept of just war by developing the theology of the Knight of Christ, a new ideal of warrior monk that combined military bravery with spiritual purity. This innovative vision, which religiously legitimized armed struggle in service of the faith, not only shaped the Templar identity, but also permanently transformed medieval conceptions of warfare and spirituality. Chapter 4. Writings and Theological Legacy. Saint Bernard's enduring impact on the history of Christianity lies chiefly in his remarkable writings and theological legacy. His intellectual influence led to swift canonization in 1174, merely 21 years after his death, and culminated in 1830 when Pope Pius VIII officially elevated him to the status of Doctor of the Church, bestowing upon him the evocative title of Dr. Mellifluus, the doctor whose words flow sweet as honey. Bernard's enduring legacy rests significantly on his extraordinary literary and theological output. Among his most notable works is On Grace and Free Will, De Gratia et Libero Arbitrio, which explores the complex relationship between divine grace and human freedom, providing a balanced perspective that profoundly influenced generations of theologians. Equally influential is the previously mentioned De Consideratione, a profound treatise that articulated a vision of the papacy combining authority with humility and contemplation, emphasizing that authentic church reform must begin with the Pope's personal holiness. Another foundational text, On Loving God, De Diligendo Deo, elaborates upon the intimate relationship between divine love and the Christian soul, laying out a vision of spiritual life centered on selfless love and profound personal transformation. Bernard's ability to synthesize complex theological ideas with poetic elegance made his writings the cornerstone of spiritual reflection throughout the medieval era and beyond. Yet Bernard's most significant theological innovation came through his mystical interpretation of the biblical text in his celebrated series of sermons on the Song of Songs, 1135 to 1153. Here, he reimagines the biblical poem as a profound allegory of the relationship between Christ and the Church, or between God and the individual soul. Through this contemplative approach, Bernard articulated a distinctive theology of bridal love, emphasizing an intimate, passionate union between the human soul and God, a concept that deeply influenced subsequent mystical traditions. Bernard also emerged as one of medieval Christianity's most eloquent champions of Marian devotion. In his homilies, notably De Laudibus Mariae, he articulated a deeply Christ-centered Marian theology in which devotion to Mary was inseparable from love for Christ. His famous phrase, De Maria numquam satis, of Mary, never enough, illustrates his profound reverence. Bernard is credited with influencing devotional traditions still widespread today, including the famous addition of the phrase, O clement, O loving, O sweet Virgin Mary, to the Marian prayer, Salve Regina, words that continue to echo on millions of lips across centuries. Bernard's persuasive eloquence and deep theological insight positioned him at the pinnacle of what historians identify as monastic theology, contrasting sharply with the emerging scholastic theology of his contemporaries. While intellectuals like Peter Abelard pursued rational analysis and philosophical rigor, Bernard's spirituality emphasized heart-driven devotion, arguing that divine truth is revealed more fully through a loving heart than through analytical reasoning. Pope Pius XII later recognized this dimension by calling Bernard the last of the fathers of the Church, but certainly not inferior to the first. The metaphor of the spiritual bee associated with Bernard perfectly captures his theological method. Just as bees collect nectar from diverse sources to produce honey, Bernard synthesized wisdom from scripture, tradition, and personal contemplation to produce teachings that nourished souls spiritually. His ideas inspired reform movements, religious orders, and generations of mystics seeking a more profound and authentic Christianity, grounded in God's transformative love and expressed through the language of the heart. If you are interested in deepening your knowledge about Saint Bernard and other influential saints, we recommend our ebook 50 Saints, featuring inspiring stories of saints who profoundly impacted the course of history and remain powerful intercessors for our contemporary spiritual needs. Chapter 5. Curious Facts and Lesser-Known Events. Behind the monumental historical figure of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux lie fascinating details rarely found in conventional narratives, revealing surprising aspects of his personality and influence. One of the most extraordinary is the phenomenon known as the consecrated family. Bernard not only pursued his own religious vocation, but exercised such charismatic influence that nearly his entire family followed him into monastic life. His 5 brothers became monks, 4 joined him immediately, and the eldest later. His sister Humbelina became a nun after being widowed, and even his elderly father, Tessalin, embraced monastic life, dying as a monk at Clairvaux, a rare occurrence in Christian history. Bernard's authentic humility was evident in his consistent refusal of honors and positions of power, remarkable in an era when ecclesiastical ambition was common, even among spiritual leaders. Besides declining the prestigious Archbishopric of Milan, Bernard rejected other significant promotions throughout his life, preferring to remain a simple abbot. At the peak of his influence, when he could easily have become a cardinal or even pope, he remained steadfast in his desire to live hidden in God, insisting that he served the Church best through prayer and behind-the-scenes counsel. Paradoxically, this rare humility enhanced rather than diminished his prestige, as both secular and religious leaders saw in him someone genuinely disinterested in personal gain. Medieval chronicles are filled with accounts of Bernard's thaumaturgic powers, frequently omitted in more secularized modern biographies. During his preaching journeys for the Crusades, crowds followed him not only to hear his words, but to witness miracles reportedly occurring through his intercession. In Germany, people pressed around him merely to touch him, and chroniclers recorded cases of the blind regaining sight and paralytics walking again through his prayers and blessings. Perhaps even more impressive was his capacity for peacemaking. Using only moral authority and persuasive exhortation, Bernard successfully restrained the fanatical monk Radulf, halting massacres of Jews in the Rhineland, and protecting Jewish communities in an era marked by violent religious intolerance. The symbolism of bees and honey permeating Bernardine iconography has deep roots in popular perceptions of his divine eloquence. Saint Bernard is traditionally recognized as the patron saint of beekeepers and bees, and his official epithet, Dr. Mellifluus, reinforces this symbolic connection between his words and the sweetness of honey. A charming medieval legend recounts how, during his childhood, a swarm of bees supposedly landed on his lips and deposited honey, a miraculous omen predicting the future sweetness of his speech, similar to a story told about Saint Ambrose of Milan. This apicultural symbolism captures perfectly the duality of Bernard's nature. Just as bees produce sweet honey yet also have a sting, Bernard combined inspiring words with sharp admonitions when necessary. In rich Christian iconographic tradition, Saint Bernard is portrayed with peculiar attributes encoding elements of his spiritual biography. In some medieval stained glass windows and paintings, he appears with a demon chained at his feet, a symbolic allusion either to an intense temptation he overcame by divine grace, or more commonly, to his victory over heresies and schisms, symbolizing dominance over personified evil. Another curious representation shows Bernard accompanied by a white dog, referencing a prophetic dream his mother had before his birth, in which she saw a small white puppy vigorously barking as it emerged from her womb, interpreted as symbolic of Bernard, who would become a hound of the Lord, vigilant and faithful herald of divine truth. Bernard's legacy transcended geographical, temporal, and even species boundaries. Curiously, he lends his name to one of the most recognizable dog breeds worldwide, the Saint Bernard dogs. Although this association emerged indirectly, and after his lifetime, it illustrates how his influence branched into unexpected directions. The monks of the Alpine Hospice, who developed this breed to rescue travelers lost in snowy mountains, were inspired by the charitable spirit of the saint who assisted pilgrims. Even after his death on August 20th, 1153, Bernard's impact continued to expand. Dante Alighieri, in the Divine Comedy, chose Bernard of Clairvaux as his final guide in paradise, symbolizing mystical contemplation leading to the beatific vision of God, a poetic tribute to the man who, in life, tirelessly sought intimate friendship with the divine. The extraordinary journey of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux perfectly illustrates how a life dedicated to the highest spiritual ideals can echo throughout centuries of human history. From a young Burgundian nobleman to one of the most influential figures of the medieval church, Bernard embodied the integration of profound contemplation and transformative action, demonstrating that genuine spirituality does not isolate one from the world but provides clarity and courage to face its most complex challenges. Even his apparent failures, such as the unsuccessful Second Crusade, reveal the humanity behind sainthood. A man who, despite his brilliance and charisma, confronted limits and learned from them, remaining humble in the face of divine providence's mysteries. Bernard's legacy transcends denominations and even religious boundaries, offering inspiration to anyone striving to live with integrity and purpose. His emphasis on love as the primary driving force of human existence, his courage in confronting powerful figures when necessary, and his ability to unite persuasive eloquence with concrete action continue to resonate today. If this extraordinary story of faith, courage, and transformation has touched your heart, I invite you to delve deeper into his writings and thoughts. Subscribe to our channel to explore other inspirational figures who shaped Western civilization, and share this video with friends who might benefit from the timeless wisdom of this doctor of the Church, who, 9 centuries after his death, still speaks to us with words sweet as honey about the secrets to a truly meaningful life.